Hello everyone, I'm Hetan Shah. I'm Executive Director here at the Royal Statistical Society, and I'd like to welcome you to this event today, jointly hosted by us, the RSS, and the Alliance for Useful Evidence. So after a referendum characterised by lies, mistruths and squeezing of numbers, statistics, facts and evidence, we may all be wondering whether evidence-informed policy is something of a pipe dream. You're not waving at me at the back, are you? No, somebody else. So today's event is really designed to explore that question. What's the room that we might have in our politics and our policies for evidence to inform what we do? And I'm really delighted to have Jonathan Breckon here, who's the director of the Alliance for Useful Evidence. And just a word about our two organisations. The Alliance is a network, nearly 3,000 individuals, an open access network which has been really good at publishing a variety of reports, bringing people together around how we embed evidence in policy and practice. And the RSS, a statistics body with 8,000 members around the world, again with a vision to put data and statistics at the heart of our decision making and our understanding of society. And for the RSS, evidence-based policy is a key thing. This is our data manifesto, which some of you may have seen. And one of our 10 policy recommendations in it is putting evidence at the heart of the policy process. So this is a really core area for us. In terms of today's format, Jonathan's going to kick off with a short presentation for about 20 minutes. So that'll give us some kind of basic stimulus. Then he and I will have a chit-chat here at the front for another quarter of an hour or so. So I'll be using my chair's prerogative to ask all the questions I want to. And then once I've put him through the ringer a little bit, we'll turn to you as the audience, and there'll be plenty of time. Because we don't have a panel of 17 people, there'll actually be time for the audience to get involved in this event as well. Our probable finish time is 4:30, but we'll just sort of see how everyone's energy is going. Please switch off your phones. Toilets are at the back if you need them, but hopefully you can hold it in for an hour and a half. And if you'd like to tweet, the hashtag is policy evidence. I may be doing some tweeting myself, so it's not that I'm checking my email. I'll be paying attention and tweeting along. So, with no further ado, Jonathan, can I hand over to you?
Is it completely naive to believe that evidence can get a foot in the door in decision making? Is it mission impossible, really? And I'm going to start with kind of quite negative views on this. And one is from Maynard Keynes, which is, I think, so right, which is there's nothing that politicians like so little, so I can't do my impression, likes to be well informed. It makes decision making so complex and difficult. And that's absolutely right. But it's worth reminding ourselves that using evidence, evaluation, research, data, it's hard. It's a lot more easier to do what Cameron said, which is, for me, politics shouldn't be some mind-bending exercise. It's about what you feel in your gut. And that's a common view. And it's not something we should shun, but it's what we're dealing with here. The gut instinct often trumps the awkward squad of evidence. Now, also, we're talking about pipe dream. Here's one pipe. This is marijuana, I believe. Who's an expert here? This is weed. So pipe dream, of course, comes from opiates, right? The big dream you have. Is it that sort of naive dream distant from reality? A great example would be drugs policy. Such a difficult area. Really want to move the dial on drugs. Politics, the views of some narrow areas. So I'm starting to recognise all sorts of people here that I know. So I'm having your views in my head as I say this. But trying to move the dial on drugs policy is incredibly difficult. I was speaking to somebody who was formerly in Number 10, who found a great drugs program in Barrow in Venice, and wanted the Deputy Prime Minister, a whole range of policymakers to go up there and see this harm reduction program that had the buy-in from doctors, from the police, public health workers. But they said, for heaven's sake, send back your ministers and any politicians. We don't want any of you from Whitehall to come down here to see this harm reduction program, because the politics was so toxic. We want to get on with it, please. We want to try and fix this, not have you harming things. The other challenge we have, if we're really going to make a difference, is that Platonic ideal of policy, which is somehow very rational and empirical. This is the Romef cycle. Hands up, who's familiar with this? Anyone? Okay, a few, all right. Could you describe it to me? It's the dream model of a policy, central government initiative, starting from the rationale through objectives, appraisal, monitoring, evaluation, feedback. Evidence could play a role in all of that. So from coming up with a really good reason that you've got a really good theory of change, right through to appraising the different policy options, through to evaluating what you actually implement and beyond. So that's the dream. The reality is more like this. It's a mess. This comes from the Institute for Government, which tried to map all the different decision-making about how policies are made. And of course, that's how it's made. That rational model of Romef, which I believe has sort of been quietly dropped. You certainly see it in other policy documents within central government, that the ideal model is just that. An ideal is not part of reality. So it's messy. It's also, research evidence has a very small impact into legislatures in terms of its quantity. And of course, we're more and more interested in quality. But purely on quantity, this is a pie chart by Ron Haskins, who's been a sort of major figure in the US around evidence. And this is Congress, and he's sort of shown the different contributions to congressional lawmaking. And research is 1%. It's a tiny proportion there of what's going on. In Westminster, there was a PhD study that found that only 8% of evidence given to select committees, 8%, was from universities. Maybe that's right. It doesn't seem right to me. I suspect a lot of that 8% was not just academics, but people administering universities, the mission groups, Universities UK, and so forth. It seems very small to me, though. Another challenge we have is from really highlighted by Kids Company, the demise of Kids Company. Now, the demise of Kids Company was not about evidence. It was about all sorts of reasons. I'm sure you have your reasons here too. But they claimed to be an evidence-based program. And indeed, they commissioned very expensive evaluations, what some called evaluations, the academics wouldn't call it that, including from LSE, £40,000 worth study. And what was really critical about this is a misunderstanding about what we mean by good evidence and appropriate evidence. And I'm going to revisit this in a moment. But I, as the head of the Alliance for Useful Evidence, which is a partnership, I should say, with Nesta, the innovation body for the UK, but also the Economic and Social Research Council, who've really pioneered not just their first-class research, but how you get that translation into policy and practice, but also the Big Lottery Fund. Is anyone for Big Lottery Fund here, actually? No? Good. Okay, I can be comfortable with what I say. Because I think they're basically concerned for all those millions, even billions of pounds that go into voluntary organisations, good causes. How often can you show that it's doing good? Is it even doing harm? So there's a real interest in charities here. We're not just talking about government central policy. But Kids Company was a real wake-up call because they had used that rhetoric of evidence. And to this day, I still think they had evidence to back up their claims. When they were dragged in front of the Public Accounts Committee and asked for their value for money, for their impact compared to comparison groups, I don't feel, and you might say differently, that they even knew what those questions were about. They said, we've been to academics, we've been to LSE, surely it's good. Yeah, Brexit. Can we just move on for that? It's just too depressing. I'm sure you're going to ask some questions about evidence and the referendum. But that was all my negative take on things. I want to be more positive about why I think it's not just an opiate-derived pipe dream, but evidence really can have a powerful impact, as long as we're super realistic about what we're trying to do here. But I'm going to start with one area which has really helped make the case for using evidence. It's quite controversial, And it's these standards of evidence that have been pioneered by a whole range of bodies. Data Social Research Unit, fantastic independent research body, I think pioneered these in the UK. And the idea is a simple one, if you can't read the writing, which is to start on a really simple level when you're a charity or funding an initiative, where you start on, do you have a theory of change? That's level one. Do you have something coherent, explicit about what you're trying to achieve? It's extraordinary how often people don't even have that. We've got the money, we've got a good idea, but we don't actually know how we're going to achieve our impact. We're just going to do good stuff. I'm guilty of that. We all do that. But starting at level one, can you show a theory of change? Up to level two, capturing data, just simple data. Up to three, can you have a comparison group? And that's often the critical crunch for me, trying to show, yeah, you've got a great crime reduction program, the numbers are going down, but hold on, numbers are going down generally. Are you sure your intervention had some impact? Right up to the dreams of level 4 and 5, which is about replication. We should be always wearing one single study. Can you show that there are multiple times when this seemed to work, seemed to have promise? And the dream at level 5 is systematic change. We've even got a manual that shows how you might go about this. So many bodies have been using this. There's HAT, who I see is here, a very interesting innovation body in housing. They've adapted and adopted these standards. Everyone's trying them slightly differently. Even in business, Pearson have tried them for their own activities in their business, particularly their educational business. Because they know as much as your shareholder value can show that you seem to be successful, have your products actually made a difference in the classroom? Yeah, you're making lots of money, but do they work? So they're asking really difficult questions themselves, quite brave. Nesta have also transformed, and Project Oracle, do check them out. A really interesting body, just in London at the moment, and they link up academics and commissioners of services and others in terms of, can you get evidence into practice by building some bridges there? But they have versions of these standards. So that's helped to really communicate what you're trying to do in terms of, is something good enough to make you confident to make claims in your intervention? But another transformation I found in the UK is the whole ecosystem. This is on our website, by the way, and do dig into this, because this has lots of different organisations, individuals and members of the Alliance who have done phenomenal things to help communicate evidence, translate it, produce it. And in the orange is the What Works centres, and I believe there's a number of you from these centres. They have transformed the landscape in terms of synthesising research in a way that's actionable. There's 7 of these, plus 1 in Scotland and Wales. We hope there might be a couple more down the line. Department for Education is scoping out another one. And they range from everything from policing, well-being, local economic growth. Some have been around for a while. We hosted the launch back in 2013. They include things like NICE, National Institute for Health and Care Excellence, which of course has been around for a long time and has been, if not the blueprint, but certainly an inspiration for these What Works centres. And what these centres are trying to do is bring all the best available evidence together in the way that you, say if you're in education as a teacher, a governor, a parent, policymaker, go, okay, I can no longer use the excuse of evidence is hidden behind a paywall, I can find it. And there's some fantastic resources here that you can access. So that's the orange inside of this ecosystem in the UK. But if there's a point I really want to stress, it's not just the What Works centres, important though they are, but we have lots of other fantastic bodies. And in this inner yellow, is that kind of yellow, orangey yellow, inner wobbly sausage, as we call it, there's all those non-government bodies, such as the Royal Statistical Society, such as the Education Media Centre, you come across them, checking claims in the media based on evidence. there are hundreds of these bodies, and it helps to create a rich ecosystem that I think is vital for our success in this area. Of course, the universities, vital though they are, and critically that's strategic funding from people like the Economic and Social Research Council, big lottery, vital for making a difference. So we have a really good story to tell in terms of this rich ecosystem. But we also have to build on the expertise, the knowledge, the desire and appetite for professionals. And I think this is going to be crucial so that evidence isn't a pipe dream. Going back to this ecosystem, I've got one just here for professional membership bodies and learned societies, where where they are a crucial player in this area. And we organised an event with all the heads of all the professional bodies a couple of years ago. Hetan, actually, you're in here. I think I can see you. You're just behind the other man with a beard. It's quite white male and suited, but these were an extraordinary bunch of organisations from social care, policing, the military, engineering, all those royal colleges, in health and medicine and public health. Really important audience in terms of helping to get this agenda outside of government and to the front line, so that teachers, police officers, social workers feel that evidence is their friend. It's not something that comes down on high or comes down from universities, but it's something that they can really work with and feel comfortable with. There are many things we can learn from medicine, many things that aren't appropriate to social policy. But I think what's great about medicine is the example of my own GP, who, when I went to her saying, look, the NICE guidance says you're supposed to be giving this drug to my son, they gave a great rebuttal of why the NICE guidance wasn't based on the best available evidence, and shot it down. And I said, look, but the chief medical officer of Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, they're saying you've got to do this drug, it's free, why aren't you giving it to them? And what was great is this GP had the confidence to rebut what the so-called experts were saying. I found that really good. I think they were wrong, but at least they were confident and not a passive receptacle to evidence out there. So I think professionals are crucial, and there's certainly been a groundswell of change in a whole range of areas. This lists a whole bunch of topics from medicine to management, even management, by the way. It's starting to wake up to the fact that it's not all about gurus or fads in the latest airport book about how to do good management. They might actually have to look at really good data and evidence to help with decision making. So that's a kind of timeline of different professional areas, but I think we need to do a lot more to get the professions on board and make this feel like it's their friend. What I'm also really optimistic about is the way I hope and I see increasingly we've moved beyond a very narrow view of what's research uptake, i.e. the kind of view where you do your beautiful research and then you get your press officer or somebody designing a website to create some products that hopefully your research will land, a kind of dissemination model. And there are lots of guidance of how to go about doing this sort of uptake. I've been involved in a few, but I'm hoping what we've realized is dissemination is dead. This was somebody from the World Bank, that the idea that you're just going to hopefully get that evidence out the door and it will land beautifully on your audience. Maybe you'll have a seminar in Whitehall or some fantastic media coverage and that'll make it work. No, it won't. We need a much more sophisticated view. And we did a systematic review on all the different approaches, which is this piece of research. I really recommend it. It's in also, by the way, your copies of Significance. If you're all RSS members, you should be. It's in Significance. It's a really great piece of research because we looked exhaustively at all the research evidence about the different ways, different approaches, mechanisms that could help research get into decision making. And not only did we review all the research out there, we looked really widely at the wider social science. What can we learn from behavioural insights, from management studies, social psychology and beyond, to help you make a difference. And if there's one key message, perhaps slightly depressingly, it's not that there is one key message. We need to think of the ecosystem. We need to look at the whole range of activities to have a difference. Crucially, skills is one of them. And this rather simplified Venn diagram is actually already starting to be out of date, but it comes from the UK Civil Service framework for your dream civil servant, in that your dream civil servant should be really good at evidence, but also really good at delivery, so often a failure in the UK, brilliant about the new ideas and the policy, all falls down to delivery. But also politics, not capital P politics all the time, also lowercase p, because we want them to be really good at managing their stakeholders, or their minister, or their permanent secretary. But isn't it great that evidence is in the middle, and that right in the heart of that, you have that skill base, that you're comfortable judging evidence, implementing it, as well as the politics of delivery. So we in the Alliance have been doing lots of training with civil service learning, with local authorities, with charities, and it is really necessary, partly because you can't just assume there's great wisdom and knowledge about different types of evidence. Even if you've got a social science degree, we need people to be that kind of smart consumers for the evidence that they're seeing coming through. Can you know when some think tank is bullshitting you? Do you know when that brilliantly charismatic academic is actually just one academic, and what's the wider body of evidence? So skills, training, knowledge is something we can't take for granted. We have to do more on. And it's great to see the Royal Statistical Society really take an enormous lead about some of that training for statistics and data. Having said all that about dissemination, we still need to have really good products that are tailored and targeted to our audience. Now, this is the Education Endowment Foundation's toolkit, which I think is a terrific way to navigate a vast body of systematic reviews about what works in the classroom. It's specifically aimed at pupil attainment, but actually its application is really broad. I think it's been very inspirational. You can understand some very complex evidence very quickly by the type of intervention, its value for money, how much time it would save you as a teacher in the classroom. So it's a very user-friendly, user-focused way of communicating research. And I think we need to do that. We can't just take our audiences for granted. It would be very dangerous to do so. But also we need to look at hardwiring evidence. We can't rely on really good communication, maverick entrepreneurs who they might sit in government and they might be brilliant at selling evidence, but it's still about their selling qualities and abilities. How can we hardwire into the decision-making process? Now, a really good example of championing this is being led by Centre About Science and the Institute for Government. And this is a transparency framework, which is quite a simple idea, which is, can we show the workings of government when you're doing policy making? A really simple idea of, look, we've got a new idea about, I don't know, reducing smoking or e-cigarettes in public spaces. What's the evidence behind that? How can I find it? What's extraordinary is how difficult right now it is to find evidence on websites like .gov.uk. It is hidden. It's hidden away. It's partly to do with that website, but it's also a mindset where we don't have to even show the evidence, so that we can't even judge its quality because it's hidden away. So what Centre About Science and the Institute for Government and us as a partner in that have been looking at is where you can actually judge, even score, how good you are just in the transparency of that. Really depressing how hard it is to find evidence behind major policies. The only really good one is the Treasury. They seem to be exempt from some of this stuff. So around budget time, you do find their economic evidence behind it. And you can pick it apart. The Institute for Fiscal Studies can do their own version of the budget, but at least there's something to pick apart. So hard in other areas of policy. But if we can have that expectation of showing evidence, and the South African government, for instance, in all their white papers, now have a section where you have to fill in your evidence. It can be guff, it can be rubbish, but at least you've got an evidence section, so they're going to have that expectation of looking for it. If you don't have that requirement, it's going to be so hard to get a foot in the door. So I think this is a really great initiative to try and at least start with an expectation of show your workings. But finally, a blatant plug. Do join the Alliance. As Hetan said, we're an open network. Any individual can join. I know many of you are members, but some of you aren't. In answer to this question about whether it's a pipe dream, I really don't think it is because of that ecosystem I showed, because it's not about Whitehall or government. It's about the professionals. It's about champions and local authorities. It's about the front line really pioneering this stuff. If it was left to purely top-down central government, I think it would be very difficult. And indeed, when you find examples of good practice, frequently it's not come from a minister or really high up. It's a sort of medium level where just enough power to make a difference, but not so high level that it gets into a big Daily Mail headline. So we need that breadth, we need wide coalitions to support this, not coming from top down. I think where we will fail, and it will be a pipe dream, is if we have a naive, idealistic view of evidence-based policy. And indeed, lots of people in health and medicine will get quite angry with me, even from using that phrase, evidence-based medicine, because they prefer something like evidence-informed medicine. It's quite right to say that policies should not be based purely on evidence, surely. In a democracy, it should be part of the equation. It should be something that we should look at, but it never has easy, obvious answers. And it's absolutely right and proper that decision makers, going back to that quote from Cameron, I can't use that as of tomorrow if we get Theresa May, by the way, as Prime Minister. We're talking about May as Prime Minister within a week. But I'm using it today for the last time. As Prime Minister, if Cameron says, I use my gut, he's an elected official. He is in his rights to ignore the evidence. What he's not in his rights to do is be ignorant of the evidence. And we, as that wider ecosystem, needs to bring that truth to the table to say, no, hold on a minute, you're wrong. But we mustn't have a naive view of evidence-based policy. That would be very dangerous. Policy cannot be based on evidence. It must be informed by it. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks, Jonathan. I'm sure we'd all agree that, technocracy doesn't trump democracy, but on the other hand, we've still got a way to go before evidence is sort of at the table at the level we want it. So I suppose, first question, which is kind of burning on, I think, everyone's mind, is post-referendum. What do we make of the use of evidence during that campaign, and what could be done about it? Do you have any initial thoughts?
Well, my own selfish thoughts were, I was delighted we were going to run an initiative on the referendum with Conversation. Have you come across the Conversation? Do check them out. It's a really good website that has news stories or topical issues written only by researchers. They get quite fussy about it. You can't be from a think tank. I can't write for it. You've got to be an academic and researchers to write for it. And they only look at research evidence in the thing that we funded called Evidence Check. And I think they're a really useful outlet. I don't think they're any alternative to traditional media, quite the opposite. But they are a great supplement. And I'm delighted we didn't try and do this project on Europe, because I don't think it would have got anywhere. My personal views are, I don't know, it's all so emotional and raw. I can't really think straight, but that's, it was about so many other issues. And I think we have to accept that the experts, the people in power, including myself, not that I'm in power, but we had some arrogance out there. It was a wake-up call that your beautiful economic modelling was not going to trump this feeling out there that there were these threats from Europe. But I'm sure you have very different views. Frankly, we banned talking about this internally. We're not even allowed to call it Brexit. people, because of my European colleagues, and I just don't use the phrase, call it the referendum or the vote. So I'd like to hear your views on it. But for me, evidence was irrelevant.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's worth distinguishing, I mean, from the RSS's perspective, the outcome, which was whatever the outcome was, but then the use of evidence within it. I mean, the fact that the £350 million claim which was made, which the UK Statistics Authority several times said was not true, I think close to a majority of the public still believed it towards the end of the campaign. And so, now I'm not saying if the real figure, which was something like 130 million, had been used, it would have changed the outcome of the referendum. That's a completely different point, but wouldn't it have been nice if there'd been a mechanism to hold that real figure to account, as it were?
Is it partly about facts? It wasn't even really about evidence or the economic modelling. Actually, one prediction is that the economics modelling might have got it right this time in terms of the negative impact. We dismissed that. But some of it was just basic facts, wasn't it? Which you might think differently. I think I put that in a different category of evidence, which might be slightly more research orientated. But I want to hear your views on that.
No, well, we'll bring the audience in shortly around the whole area. So I suppose, I mean, coming to sort of more practical issues in your kind of day-to-day domain, what would be examples of a kind of policy area where you think there's been really good use of evidence made?
Good examples. I think the good examples I would like to promote are the ones that are actually complex and messy, and where evidence has only been part of the picture, because that's what I'm trying to advocate. You know, the democratic values, beliefs, other ways to make decisions are just as valuable. So things like Sure Start, still a highly contested area, and really interesting what's happening now there. But in the early days under Labour, when the case was being made, certainly the way they went after systematic reviews was really interesting, and the way that evidence was used as part of the way of selling that, I think is a really good example. I like the example as well because there's still so many unanswered questions around that. I think the ban on smoking in public places, that's a really good one. In fact, the Institute for Government, if you go on their website, they've got a really good case study of that ban, because again, it was messy, and it's still unresolved with digital cigarettes, e-cigarettes. You might remember the Welsh government said they were going to ban e-cigarettes in public places, and the question is, well, hold on, what's your evidence about that? And they use the precautionary principle, and like, well, don't know yet. But I think that's a really good example, because there was lots of media criticism in some quarters of the ban, and John Reid, who was health minister at the time, was also very sceptical. He thought it would, quite rightly, harm perhaps the poorest parts of the community, and it was a kind of elitist push. So there are lots of examples, but my favourite ones are where they're messy, because that's the real world.
Okay. You've reached quite far back into history for those examples. Any more recent examples you might sort of
over the last, I can't think of it.
Right,
and the reason why I can't is that we've just announced terrible timing, a prize for the best use of evidence by politicians. And we really should have pulled it, I suppose. It's with the Political Studies Association, and we've been looking far and wide, and all we can find is fantastic examples of terrible abuse of evidence, which is really the prize I want to do. But that might be for another time. It's really, really depressing. Where you find good examples is more like local champions or under the radar. I mean, if you go to something like the Department for Education, who I think have done some fantastic investments in evidence, you almost need to go to certain sub-Gove when he was Secretary of State to find your champions there. I'm also not clear what policies are anymore. That's partly looking at the transparency of policies. It's really hard to get your hands and grip on what a policy is. I thought I knew what it was. I thought the Institute for Government might tell me. Even they're going, we're not actually sure. It's a kind of vague commitment. It certainly isn't white papers or legislation alone. So, yeah, sorry I can't answer your question. If you do, particularly if you know any MPs or anyone in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, elected representatives who created or pioneered or got behind really good evidence, do let us know, because we can nominate them for our prize.
Okay. Well, one area you talked about were the What Works centres. Now, this is an area where government has put quite a bit of money in through one channel or another. Can you say a bit more about it for those that are less familiar with them, and give us your own sort of assessment of them?
Yeah, I mean, I think the What Works centres have really transformed the landscape, and it's partly because I've been doing this game for many decades, and so often what you used to hear in the past was, I as a civil servant or as a frontline professional, I can't access research, it's hidden behind paywalls, it's in academic gobbledygook. This is a way of synthesising research and communicating it in a way that anyone can understand. I think that's really very, very helpful. And one measure of success of those What Works centres is the phenomenal amount of all other organisations that want to have that brand. They want to be a What Works centre, and globally, the French government, the Dutch government, the Australians, it goes on and on. So fair play to the What Works centres. Now, not all of them will succeed. As I said, there are 7. There are actually 9, Scotland and Wales, but they can't be called that for political reasons. And more coming down the line. It's just inevitable that not everything will be successful. I think they've worked really well about being transpartisan, as in it's not just a coalition government initiative. They were launched in my organisation offices in 2013, these What Works centres. And it was Oliver Letwin and Danny Alexander. Oliver Letwin, Minister of the Cabinet Office at the time, and Oliver Letwin, who was the Treasury Chief Secretary. Remember them, the Lib Dems? And it was, what's great, and I think fair play again to the What Works centres, is it hasn't been, I was going to say tarnished, I won't say that, but it hasn't seemed to be like a conservative-driven initiative. People have forgotten that actually a big drive for this What Works initiative came from Labour. It was in the Labour manifesto where the language was there. It was in speeches, and NICE, of course, comes from pre-coalition, pre-conservative days.
Just tell people what NICE is.
NICE is the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. So the health body that does guidance, reviews and support for, based on research evidence, but also many other things to help make decisions about what drug and what intervention you can use.
And do we have any feel yet for which What Works centres are doing well, or what makes the difference?
I think a really good example would be the Education Endowment Foundation, when they think about this whole ecosystem and the whole almost life cycle of evidence. So they're not just summarising research, they're also commissioning their own trials and evaluations and things that aren't sort of working, or they're involved in helping with teaching assistants, which looked like, according to the evidence, that they weren't doing much help in terms of pupil attainment, doing lots of other brilliant things. So they're really getting their hands dirty in a whole life cycle. And I think that's really impressive, because if it's only about a passive summary research out the door, I think that would fail. And also they seem to be growing in terms of nuance. I think there's 2 people from the EF here, so they're going to shoot me down. But I mean, I'm giving you praise, but I think you're also growing in your understanding, perhaps more engaging with realist approaches or things about context of evidence. They're on a really interesting journey.
Okay, good. Final question for me is, I suppose, you in your slide you showed there's a whole ecosystem of organisations in this space, including yourself, Sense About Science, Institute for Government, the RSS as sort of civil society bodies. You've got universities, you've got the What Works centres and so on. I mean, what do we as a kind of movement for evidence need to do next to take this up to the next level?
I think to get to the next level, I think there's 2 things. One is I go to way too many events where there's a criticism of this agenda because there's a straw man that's put up of evidence-based policy, i.e. some dream, rational, empirical, ideal that just doesn't exist. And of course it doesn't. And it's really unhelpful to always shoot it down. I think maybe we just got to drop that phrase, evidence-based policy. It's usually that. I've got a whole pile of books on my desk by brilliant academics saying that advocates of this, or saying this, that, and the other. No, we're not. No, where are you saying this? There's this straw man of evidence-based policy, and let's just get rid of that. That would be really helpful if it's about us as perhaps the interest in driving this forward. I think the second area I'd like to see a lot more at is the democratic deficit here. So going back to Brexit, I still feel this is a technocratic, still quite elitist. Researchers know best. I think we need to understand, appreciate and engage more with the wider public. And it's fantastic we have a full fact, sense about science. These are brilliant bodies. But how do we get out to the wider audiences who are frankly sceptical of any sort of expertise and not being sneering and aloof? But this is a genuine, I don't give a monkeys about your economic analysis, I've got this problem in my local community. So a more democratic engagement, and I'm really interested to try and find out the NICE model. This is the health and social care model, where they use things like citizen panels to try and get more engagement with the wider public. I still feel they're a bit opaque how that NICE model works, but we have to engage more widely with the wider public.
Okay. Well, in a small step towards moving from elitism to democracy, we'll move from you and I talking now to you, the wider public, in here. So I think we've got some microphones at the back somewhere, and if what we'll do is we'll take 2 or 3 comments or questions at a time, and then Jonathan can respond. Start with here. You can say who you are and if you're from an organisation, that'd be great.
I'm Stephanie Matheson. Can you all hear?
Yep.
Yeah.
Stephanie Matheson from Sense About Science. I wondered what you thought of the notion that the public can't handle the truth and that honest politicians would just be voted out. I and Sense About Science would strongly disagree with that. We see that the public can handle information, but it's one of those sort of straw man type ideas that's floated as a barrier to evidence-based policy.
Okay.
But I would also agree with you that evidence isn't the only thing. It should be value-driven as well, policy decisions.
Somebody next to you, so we'll pass the mic on.
Thank you. Hamish Chalmers from Oxford Brookes University. In 1996, Dave Sackett and colleagues defined evidence-based medicine, which is a term they continue to use, as the joining together of individual clinical expertise and external evidence. Later on, about 6 months after that, they published another thing which brought evidence-based medicine at the intersection between those two things and patient value and choice. I think that in medicine, patients are uniquely positioned to articulate their choice. In a meeting with a clinician, I can say, I want pain control or I want a new hip. And then the other two parts of the evidence come into play. I'm an educationalist, so what's unclear to me is how you can bring the equivalent of end-user voice into the whole ecosystem of evidence-based, evidence-supported or evidence-informed. So I think that kind of links to the last point that you made in the previous question. How do we bring the consumer voice into this ecosystem of evidence-based?
Great. Do you want to take those 2 to start with?
Yeah, I mean, this goes exactly to what I was saying about that democratic deficit. I mean, I think when it comes to education, talking to colleagues who've been involved as teachers in actually sort of championing evidence in schools, they found one of the most productive things in terms of getting those user feedbacks was actually getting them involved in the research itself. The sort of co-production element of it. And then they became your zealots who could help go out there and proselytize in the wider world. Now, I think behind your question is what are the mechanisms, and that's exactly what my question was. I did a joint piece of work with NICE. Sorry to bang on about NICE, but they've been so inspirational in this field, even though they come from health. And of course, they do cover social care, so they're not just sort of narrow drugs. I think the Saskett model, which brought in not just pure science, but these other things, is such an important, and people forget that outside of medicine, so I'm really glad you brought it up. But what are the mechanisms, rather than like I'm just taking the views of teachers because they've been surveyed, or I've spoken to 1 or 2 of them, what are the robust measures, I think is a really important question. I don't have the answer. I found the NICE approach. Is anyone from NICE, please? Ah, brilliant. So maybe they can answer. how they use their citizen councils? Is that the right term, or citizen? It's citizen. Should we get a quick so you can?
My name's Kathleen Williams. I'm actually here for Healthwatch UK, the charity, today. But as it happens, I am a fellow with NICE. I have a fellowship, so that means I'm an ambassador for 3 years. I'm a member of the public. I'm a consumer.
Yeah.
And NICE does more than drugs, of course, and social care guidance. I came into NICE through being on a clinical guideline as a member of the public, involved in equality with clinicians making clinical guidance by looking at evidence, which is such an exciting thing. So I haven't had direct involvement with the NICE Citizens Council, but I'm reading about it at the moment. It's one of the very exciting things about NICE, how they involve members of the public in equality to develop values that underpin the work.
Okay, thank you. Is anybody else here who's got an answer to that? I mean, there's so much expertise in this room, so do others have good ideas about how we can bring the user voice in, things that you're working on? No, it's too early in the day. Here we go.
Thanks. My name is Charlie. I currently work for the government, but I've worked in the past for Full Fact as well. I suppose it's somewhat twee now to keep talking about these things, but there are all sorts of things out there that start to get at this. For example, the RSPB gets members of the public to do a bird survey. It's a very simple example, but it starts to leverage the power of citizens to collect data about what interests them. On a slightly more interesting level, as regards education, there are websites online where you can rate your teacher and rate your education experience. Ofsted, for example, the schools inspectorate has websites called Parent View, where parents express views about their school, and they use that as part of their inspection. So this is starting to happen, but I think there's a big gap there for collecting evidence from members of the public online. Of course, there are many advantages and disadvantages to that. There's the old convenient sample survey thing where only people with very extreme views tend to report back, but I think there'd be ways of using that great power that we've got as more and more people are connected to start getting into people's opinions in the right ways. I don't have the answer, that's more of a question, but that seems to me to be the direction of travel.
Thank you very much. Jonathan, do you want to come back to the question about whether the public can handle the truth?
Yeah, who's going to say, oh, the public, you can't handle the truth, you're so ignorant? I won't say that, but I mean, we do need the intermediaries in terms of the reason why I voted for my politician is I don't have all the time to get my head around all the difficult issues and the complexity, including Europe. I'm still learning stuff, that's what we voted them for. That's what a representative democracy is. I think, it's a really hard message to say, the public can't understand it. I think there might be a crucial role, going back to my thing about professionals, as a key way in, rather than a sort of rump of the public. And I think if there's something we've learned from this systematic review funded by the Wellcome Trust and others, called The Science of Using Science, it's actually about the social science of using science, but let's not pick details in it. I think if there's one thing...
Social science is a science, of course.
It is, but it depends. Yeah, it's got its uniqueness as well. Yes, I see it here as well, so I'm sure they have views. But you're right. I think getting to the professionals is going to be vital. I think the sort of intelligent demand we just can't take for granted, and that's why I think it's fantastic the Royal Statistical Society, the Nuffield Foundation, the ESRC, and others are doing training. For even social science undergraduates to get them better about quantitative skills. You can't just take that as a given. It's hard, even as experts dealing with the difference between relative risk and absolute risk. These are hard ideas that I'm afraid with a degree and a master's at good universities, I don't feel I came out with it fully equipped. I had to learn that afterwards and do training afterwards. So I think looking at even going far back as primary education is vital. Now, I know often we use education as our panacea, but I think if you want intelligent demand, you need to understand statistics, data, and these different approaches to evidence. They're just not ever given, even with a social science degree.
Okay, thanks. More questions? Let's got 1, 2, 3 at the back there. we'll come to you. We'll come forward, I think. So.
Yes, Simon Briscoe from No Fixed Abode. Can I just take you back to Brexit and the 350? Just bear with me before you boo me out of the room. My point here is not really about the 350, but it's about the nimbleness of the organisations which are claiming to be the experts. Because the UK Statistics Authority put out its press notice saying that the 350 shouldn't be on the bus, etc. But if you still go and look at table 9.9 of the offending Pink Book, gross contributions is still there at 19.1 billion, which if you divide by 52, you get 350. So, you know, I felt that was a pretty unhelpful contribution, because there you have an authority which is saying, do as I say, not do as I do. The very least they should have done is amend their table, or put a footnote, or put the deductions in before you get to the gross figure. So I think there's a bit of a conflict there. Park that for a second. My second point was about full fact, and I declare because I'm a trustee. But I think their approach to evidence is rather a better example of being nimble. And over the existence of full fact, they've done hundreds, probably thousands of fact checks. Inevitably, a lot of this is about shades of grey. You don't always get it exactly right first time when you're trying to do something in a hurry. A piece of new evidence might come to light. The publication of fact check might prompt a previously reluctant minister or some other institution to offer another piece of evidence, and therefore the fact check can change. And I think what I've concluded from this is that we should try and encourage an environment where people are prepared to be a little bit nimble and accept that it isn't black and white and it's all shades of grey, and we ought to just try and edge there. And perhaps if, as a society or a media, we were not quite so, we were more permissive of people who wanted to slightly change their views as evidence changes, maybe that would be a good thing.
Great, thank you. Now there's somebody, I think, 2 rows ahead who had their hand up. If you might put your hand up again, is that it? There's certainly the lady in the pink there. Yeah.
Hi, Yvonne Kelly, University College London. In terms of bad policies that harm the population, can or should policymakers be held to account in the eyes of the law?
Okay. I think there was one other on that side, if anyone wants. No? Okay. Do you want to pick those 2 up?
So Full Fact is a fantastic body. Going back to that map, it's not a map, sorry, the geographers are shooting down, the infographic of the ecosystem, Full Fact are right in there. The only thing I'd just say that so many other important players, like the Education Media Centre, Just Working in Education, Institute for Fiscal Studies, all those other bodies are fantastic and you know, I think can be nimble too. And an important part of it, but Full Fact are fantastic. It just felt to me that selfishly I was glad we didn't spend an enormous amount of time in Europe, but it was kind of going to be irrelevant what we were going to say in that specific area. But you might think differently.
Well,
I think
what do you think of Simon's point about creating a culture which is more open to uncertainty, changing of mind as new evidence comes, etc.? I mean, how do we do that?
I think it's a really good point, and it probably just goes hand in hand with evidence that it is often about those grey areas and not black and white. I love that. Simon, did you write for the FT? Was that you? No. Yeah, you were the FT. You remember when Tim Harford and the FT championed this cause of a prize for the best reversal of policy in the face of evidence? I would love that to be funded, because that is the nature of our game. You finished with another Keynes quote about what you do say in the face of the facts. I changed my mind. We should celebrate that change in the mind, and it goes back to my democratic deficit. We need the public, the people in the media, not to jump on people straight away because they got it wrong. Well, you don't have to get it wrong. Things change. We all change our views in our personal life. I would love to do the Tim Harford Prize and celebrate that. How we get that more nuanced public discussion about grey areas, I don't know. Answers in the back of an envelope, please.
And then on the flip side, do we hold people to account if policies become actively harmful when the evidence would have shown that was the case?
I sense about science. This is your moment. You're very good at that. Do you want to say what you do about bringing people to account when they abuse evidence or bad policy making?
The microphone's just coming.
Bringing people to account, mainly we do something called for the record. If we've seen something in the newspaper that is badly reported, we'll go to the researchers if we can identify them from the piece and get them to clarify what was actually meant by their research.
Yeah.
And newspapers do seem to take it quite seriously. Their feelings are hurt. They notice when they've been in a for the record. So that's one way that we do it. And we're moving into more policy stuff now. So
Yeah.
similar things to come, perhaps.
And in terms of sort of naming and shaming, I think we need that as well. But the evidence from sort of behavioural science as well is you don't want to be completely negative. I think some positive support, some champions to celebrate would also be good. But the Public Accounts Committee, the reason why they grilled the kids company, and particularly the civil servants, was not only all those issues about governance. Of course, there were so many issues for the demise of kids company, but they also laid into them, like, you spent millions of pounds without ever asking for any sort of robust evaluation. And I think the Public Accounts Committee does a great job about that, calling to account. I'm slightly depressed by how other select committees can be quite wishy-washy on evidence. Although there's now these evidence checks, have you come across these? The Education and Skills Select Committee, Science and Technology, are actually vetting the evidence used by government departments, which is a really good initiative. And they're using this transparency framework led by Centre About Science and IFG to look at how evidence is used by departments. I think that's a great initiative, but the problem I'm having with select committees, and anyone who can help me, is getting them to be a little bit more robust about what they quantify as evidence. For them, evidence could be just sort of anything goes. It's not, it could be one study or an expert. I would love to have more robust systematic reviews with all the gaps in there and all the flaws of that, but at least it's transparent, rather than my favourite Oxbridge academic coming in front of my committee. But these evidence checks, Google them, they're on our website. They're a great way to bring people to account, empower.
Great, thank you. Another round of questions, comments? Right, so we've got a couple here, so one at the front here and one at the back there.
Michael Fleming, Department of Health. You can't ever talk about the evidence, can you? You talk about some, because if we want to win an argument, we bring out the evidence that supports our case. But just thinking, what is evidence when, say, in weekend mortality rates, when many interpret the statistics as being there is evidence, strong evidence of increased mortality at weekends. Others look at the same and find a contradictory view. Now, who adjudicate? Well, they've both been very good. They've used the evidence, the so-called the evidence. I would argue they haven't. They've used some evidence.
Okay, thank you. And somebody at the back there.
Thanks. My name's Jennifer Crease. I work at NCVO. I worry slightly that in our debate about evidence we're talking about, and I think that piece of from Nestor and others on hierarchies of evidence is useful, but I think there's a danger that we end up, and I think there's a discussion now that evidence equals quantitative data, and I think there's a huge range of different types of data that are well used as good evidence. And I know that in lots of areas that quantitative, we can't always replicate in certain scenarios. We can't always provide RCTs to evidence what's going on. And I think there's a danger that we kind of throw out a lot of very good data by kind of demanding quantitative statistics all the time, rather than actually kind of accepting that there's a wider range of good evidence. And then there was a kind of a second point around that I think another gentleman touched on around, I think the difficulty, particularly with the media, is that often it's not about facts, it's about weight of evidence. So we can't always say, X, this is X, and therefore this is what we should be doing as a result. It's about weight of evidence, and I think that's so much more difficult to convey to the public and to journalists, and I think that's part of one of the kind of wider issues around kind of evidence-based policy making as well.
Okay, so those are three quite subtle issues for you to explore. So, there is no the evidence, and so what happens when people are cherry picking and who adjudicates, the dangers around quantitative data and bloody statistics, particularly in the third sector, but not just in the third sector, and what about kind of the weight of evidence, how we communicate that?
Yeah, really good questions. I mean, I think in terms of the evidence and the cherry pick, but I really want to plug a fantastic book coming out by an academic called Justin Parkhurst, LSE. Unfortunately, it's still not out for a few months. It's called The Politics of Evidence-Based Policymaking. And he is great about all the different, he's categorized all the different distortions and biases of evidence, including the cherry picking one. But that's only the start of it. There are so many other ways that you can have more technical biases, but also what he calls issue bias, which can be things like, evidence could be a sort of a rhetoric to hide a whole bunch of political issues. And it can be quite a dangerous sort of process of depoliticization, i.e. evidence can somehow answer your questions without democracy. That is dangerous and wrong and goes back to this false straw man we need to get rid of. Going back to what I said about the House of Commons Select Committee, in terms of they like cherry-picking evidence, that's why we're saying trying to do systematic reviews. I know they're deeply flawed, but at least you've gone out there and had a body of evidence, you're transparent about how you went about it, you might be weighting it differently compared to the other question, rather than just one piece of evidence. Who adjudicates that? I don't know. It's a hard one, but at least we've gone for the breadth. And even unconsciously, we cherry pick evidence. That's what we've learned from behaviours. Because you're quite right. You want to win your argument, and it's quite depressing how many worthy bodies will cherry pick and distort evidence. It's human nature. I mean, going back to the question from NCVO about quant. My dream, going back to systematic reviews, is if we can have mixed methods where you bring in both. One of the associates of the Alliance, Professor David Goff, has been banging on about this for how many years? I don't know, maybe 20 years, forever. We're still not quite there yet, but absolutely qualitative can bring things alive. If there's one thing we really try to hammer home with our training for civil servants and others, is the message of horses for courses, i.e. appropriateness, proportionate. So try and find the evidence that matches your question, rather than like only RCTs count. So when it's impact questions, and that you saw the Nestor standards of evidence, that's about impact. There might be other ways of doing that. I think qualitative research can answer all sorts of questions. So yeah, mixed methods is my dream. It's not a new dream, but let's bring it on. What was the last question? I can't remember. I wouldn't make it.
The weight of evidence. How do we communicate the weight of evidence, particularly in the media? So I mean, for example, in climate change debates, there's always that notion of balance, isn't there? But
yeah, I mean, I don't know the easy answer to that one. I mean, again, I think probably the more common one in terms of weight of evidence is single studies. And I've got a whole raft of examples. Sense About Science, by the way, is great in this. Science stories where, you've got one story about coffee giving you, make you live 10 years longer, and then next week, same headline, coffee will kill you. So trying to say it's not about one study, but we need multiple studies, we need replication, or we need bodies of evidence is a great start. How you communicate things like p-values, and I don't know, Simon, maybe at the back, the FT, you probably had a way of communicating weight of evidence that could persuade
I quite like the idea of having 99 climate scientists on the one side and the one anti-climate scientist. I mean, that's quite a visual way of communicating the balance. Is there appetite for one last round of questions? Yeah, people are shooting up now.
And anything from EEF, by the way, because I hope I haven't introduced you in terms of, I know there's 2-3 people from EEF.
So we've got a triangle here of 3, so we'll make this the last. You've all been very helpful in keeping your clusters of questions close together. Which is very nice.
Hi, I'm Lizzie Jordan from the Money Advice Service, and I hope I'm not about to slightly repeat the last questions, but I think for me it's about, do we, as the kind of communicators of evidence, need to think more about how we communicate the weaknesses, trade-offs, complexity, difficulties of using evidence. Because I feel that in our efforts to get funders and decision makers and policy makers on board, there are ways that we present the evidence questions that can be unhelpful. So using phrases like what works, and we have a what works fund. So I'm not saying that we've solved that. Using things like the standards of evidence ratings, which imply that there is a clear hierarchy, can lead to oversimplifications of very complicated questions, and also the view that there are single answers, and this is something that we can make a decision on very quickly. So do we have to think more about how we say this isn't a simple question, and it's a complicated decision?
Carl Allen, a member of the public. Well, the public holds their evidence, and the public holds their beliefs, and the researcher presents their evidence, and the evidence begins to attack the belief, and is badly beaten up.
Beaten up?
So, do we need a change of tactics entirely? That's one. Two, we say weight of evidence, and as far as the public concerned, it's not so much weight of evidence, it's years of evidence that works. So if we look at smoking and alcohol, it wasn't the weight of evidence that sort of settled the issue. It was the years of evidence. So again, we shouldn't have to wait years. We should go by weight. How do we bring those two together in some way?
Thank you. We've got somebody 2 rows behind you. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Kevin McConway. I was employed as an academic statistician until earlier this year, so that's my background. I'd just like to comment, really, rather than ask a question, on the aspect of cherry picking that was mentioned, the aspect of weight of evidence, because I think these relate to something that from outside it often looks as if we don't do, or don't do enough of, in my view, which is to take into account values, differing values across users, differing values across the electorate, or whatever. The point is that in deciding whether one is cherry-picking, one needs to know what evidence is relevant, and what evidence is relevant to a particular individual depends on their values and what they see as important. For instance, if I didn't care about the UK sovereignty, I would not be interested in evidence in relation to the EU referendum as to whether sovereignty was actually going to be reduced, increased, or whatever. I have to think that's important, and different people have different values on this. Similarly, in terms of weight of evidence, what is weight depends on how you're going to put together conflicting objectives, evidence on conflicting objectives, and deal with the trade-offs. And in things like deciding what the weight of evidence is that global warming is happening and caused by humans, that's a relatively simple thing to look at, and it's possible to come up with a reasonable way of getting across the weight of evidence and avoiding phony balance. But if you're saying what action should we take in relation to that, when there's a whole lot of very different alternatives and all kinds of different evidence of different kinds of, quantitative and not, about how to do that, it's much more difficult. Similarly, it's interesting that so much of this developed initially from medicine, public health, what NICE do, and so forth, where I'm not saying things are easy in those areas, but they are a lot simpler, arguably, than some others. The point that was made earlier on about Sackett's view that evidence-based medicine should include various things, including patient choice. The point is that in medicine, it's possible to a certain extent, at least, to deal with patients on an individual clinical basis, so that if somebody has different feelings about different levels of disability for them, you can treat them differently from the next patient who has different views. There are many other aspects of policy where we simply can't do that, and we have to talk about the idea of the user view. When there is not one user view, there's a multiplicity of user views, and the position of using evidence in that complicated context is something which is just not that simple, and I think we don't always get across that actually this is difficult. We're not saying the facts speak for themselves, but it often comes across as if we are, I think.
Thanks, Kevin. So, Jonathan, final
that's
questions
a good way
and
to
reflections.
finish, because I mean the fact that's the sort of the straw man of the fact speaks for themselves, of, you know, is this all rather simplistic, is perhaps we are guilty of that because you use the language of evidence-based policy of what works. And it instantly sounds like simplification over simplification. The challenge I have is so this initiative goes back a long way, arguably, you know, depths of classical civilization, but let's go just for that language of what works, was pushed under New Labour. And some of you remember the Centres for Evidence-Based Policy and Practice, funded by the ESRC. And I think they had some fantastic resources. They were kind of like what work centres, and they wanted to push this initiative. And they had a centre in London with lots of hubs all across the UK. And if you Google it, they've still got some great reports. I try to get, lots of people are now sort of semi-retired or involved in it, but I try and get them to write blogs for us so we can learn from that. There's never been a formal evaluation of it, but I think what I've learned from that is you do need to start simple to get a foot in the door. Maybe that's our downfall. You know, I think the What Works brand, if there was one agreement in all the planning meetings, everyone shot down it, you know, it wanted to be what works for whom, why, where, and how, the centre. You know, that one name, what a brand. Whereas what works, you know, Hetan and I would be going to the party conferences, for instance. You get people's attention. If I went evidence-informed decision-making with lots of provisos, I can't get a foot in the door. But you might need to start over simplistic, and then you dig deeper. The standards for evidence, I was a big skeptic of. I commissioned, I think, one of the best critiques of them by Sandra Nutley, Edinburgh University. Do read it. It's a great criticism of hierarchies. I've now changed my mind because I need some kind of framework and model to go, yeah, I know you've got a survey in your members and they think you're great, but actually it's slightly different to saying you really had an impact, and that's it's simplistic, and I think we need to make it more nuanced. But I think a complex spreadsheet, which I did actually try to devise, of different evidence questions versus different types of evidence and match them, too complicated. Starting simple and then quickly getting complicated is the best I've got. But you know, there isn't a simple answer. I would not start from the hyper complex. I can't start my conversation with a politician saying, you know what, we just don't know. I actually frequently do, but I think it just doesn't work.
Well, I think we're going to wrap up there. I'd like to thank all of you for participating so lively in this debate, especially in that kind of hot room, so I'm sorry about that. You can go and get your glass of water now. I'd like to thank Jonathan for what's been a really grand tour through the kind of complex landscape of evidence policy. And the takeaways for me are it is complicated, there's no single silver bullet, but also I'm heartened by the range of players in the movement. And I think if we all work together, you know, having not the ambition of a utopia, but just kind of taking one further step forward in all of this will be really positive. So I hope you'll join me in thanking Jonathan for a great talk.